What is up, and welcome back to Beyond the Arc with Brandon Silvers. As always, I am your host, Brandon Silvers. Hope you've had a great week talking about the Doc Rivers effect and how it's ruining everything. The list is extensive, so let's get into it. Just a year after giving him a record-setting, nearly $80 million contract, the Detroit Pistons have fired head coach Monty Williams. That means he's getting paid $65 million to not coach the Pistons, in addition to the $20 million the Phoenix Suns are paying him to not coach them. This is my dream job, so the fact that he's living it out has activated the hater within me, and by most accounts, Monty's a great guy, but he's got some pretty big flaws as a coach, flaws that ended his son's tenure and doomed his Pistons job from the jump. Now, in fairness to Monty, a little bit of background on him that I try to keep in mind with everyone I critique, and that is that this is a person first and foremost, and he's a person who has been through a lot. So again, I'm not shitting on Monty the human here. That would make me a terrible person. As a player, he missed 2 seasons of college dealing with a heart condition. Then, while he was an assistant coach with the Thunder in 2016, his wife, with whom he had 5 children, was killed in a car accident. He has since remarried, but then it came out that after he was let go by the Suns, his second wife was diagnosed with breast cancer during the playoffs of that year. I imagine that, combined with how things ended in Phoenix, played a huge role in him wanting to take a year off. But when someone offers you $80 million, that has a way of making you show up to coach even if you don't want to. And even if Monty deserves every last penny and more due to all he's been through, it's pretty obvious that he was coaching like someone who didn't want to coach last season. He had his hands full as he took over a 17-win team that had played much of the previous season without their best player, Cade Cunningham. However, they had identified some young pieces that showed promise, most notably Jaden Ivey. So expectations weren't super high headed into last year, but getting Cade back along with Ivey continuing to develop should have led to a few more wins. Vegas set their over-under at 28.5 wins heading into the season. The Pistons instead tied the NBA record for most losses in a row by losing an astonishing 28 consecutive games. They actually lost 7 in a row after ending the streak, so they lost 35 out of 36 games at one point in the season. They finished the season with 14 wins, 3 fewer than the previous year, and less than half of what Vegas was thinking. And everything was made harder by how Monty handled his rotations, specifically Jaden Ivey. Jaden looked very Dwayne Wade-ish as a rookie, going for 16 points, 5 assists, and 4 rebounds per game. He had a lot to work on, but you could see the vision, and a lot of his issues were a lack of experience thing where he just needed to get more game reps. So what did Monty do? Cut his minutes. A kid who had actually improved the previous season the more time he got, putting up 19 points, 4 rebounds, and 7 assists in 34 minutes per game post All-Star break as a rookie, was struggling to get 20 minutes per game to start this season. Not so coincidentally, this also coincided with that losing streak. Who was ahead of Ivey in the rotation? Killian Hayes, a draft bust who the Pistons were trying to move on from, but Monty thought he could save. The team finally waived him in February, most likely to save Monty from himself. Alienating star players has been the biggest knock on Monty as a coach. It's certainly not every star player, but you have to have buy-in from your key guys, and for better or worse, they get treated differently. Better differently. But that's not really Monty's thing, as we saw with how his relationship with DeAndre Ayton fell apart. But I don't blame Monty for this. No, I blame Doc Rivers. Why? The year is 2000. We survived Y2K. The PlayStation 2 has just come out. Whistle While You Twerk, Country Grammar, and Wobble Wobble are dominating the charts. And Doc Rivers has just been named Coach of the Year for his work with the Orlando Magic, and he's headed into the most important free agency period of his career. The Magic had just wildly overachieved under Doc in what I still think is his greatest coaching performance, going 41-41 and nearly making the playoffs with Darrell Armstrong as their leading scorer and assist man, and a young Ben Wallace as their leading rebounder. They headed into the offseason with a ton of cap space and were planning to use it to take a swing at as many big-name free agents as possible, and they started 2 for 2, landing Tracy McGrady, fresh off a breakout season with the Raptors at 20 years old, and Grant Hill, who is a bona fide superstar with the Pistons. If you didn't see Grant at his peak, or maybe you forgot, this was a legitimate face of the league guy. His Sprite commercials played all the time, and a lot of kids, myself included, had been wearing his Fila's along with our Jordans in elementary school. Now, as we know, the T-Mac signing worked out pretty good, but the Hill signing didn't, as he struggled with injuries and a MRSA infection that almost killed him. However, they might have ended up okay despite that if their third signing had worked out. See, the Orlando Magic were frontrunners to land Tim Duncan that offseason. Duncan hadn't even hit his prime yet, but he was already an NBA champion and top 5 player in the league. Landing him alone would make you an instant title contender. Pairing him with another star would make you a powerhouse. 2 stars like the Magic already had, you're looking at a potential dynasty. I mean, even if Grant Hill still had his health problems, the only team with an answer for T-Mac and Tim Duncan would have been the Shaq and Kobe Lakers. The Eastern Conference would have been a cakewalk. In 2001, the AI-led 76ers made the finals out the East. Look, AI is AI, but I can't imagine those 76ers beating a Tim Duncan and T-Mac-led Orlando Magic. Same with the New Jersey Nets, who made it out of the East the following 2 seasons. Their best player was Jason Kidd, who was an MVP candidate at the time, but look at the rest of that roster. Kenyon Martin, Kerry Kittles, and Richard Jefferson. With all due respect, let's be for real, nobody averaged 20 points per game on that entire team. So the Magic probably get a shot at the title for 3 seasons at least, even without Grant Hill, but Duncan ended up re-signing with the Spurs. Why? Well, Doc Rivers. The way Grant Hill has told this story, when the Magic are making their pitch to Tim, everything is going according to plan, and they go out to dinner. At this dinner, which Hill was at with his wife Tamia, Tim asked Doc if his wife could travel on the team plane during road trips. This is incredibly common now, but I guess it wasn't at the time. And Doc said, no, it's a business trip, which I mean, okay, but this is Tim Duncan. It wasn't some outrageous request. If I'm the coach, she can have my seat. I'll sit in the overhead compartment. Tim really didn't say anything though, and they just carried on. Grant says when he got back to his room with Tamia, she told him Tim was not going to come to the Magic. Grant's like, what do you mean? I thought that went well. And Tamia said, I saw his wife's body language shift after that question. It's not happening. Sure enough, she was right. Duncan re-signed with the Spurs, and we see how that turned out. While the Magic did manage to make the playoffs under Doc, including the first of his many playoff failures where they managed to blow a 3-1 lead to the Pistons in the first year the league expanded the first round to best of 7, he was eventually fired. And who was on the roster as a role player for several of these years? No doubt hearing story after story of why they had to play post-Seattle Patrick Ewing and barely tread water instead of being a title contender because of Doc's inability to read the room with a star player. That's right, Monty Williams. But Doc wasn't done wreaking havoc on the league. No, he moved on to coaching the Boston Celtics, who had gone on a couple of runs in that weak Eastern Conference we just talked about, and were looking to take the next step. Unfortunately for them, they get worse each season under Doc, bottoming out as a 24-win team. Bill Simmons was losing his mind trying to get Doc fired, but they keep him, and former Celtics legend, then T-Wolves GM Kevin McHale swoops in to save the day by trading megastar Kevin Garnett to Boston, who had also acquired star Ray Allen as well earlier that offseason. With Paul Pierce already there, Doc fell ass backwards into a big 3 as formidable as the one he scared off in Orlando, and Boston won 66 games on their way to their first NBA title since 1986, and the sports media world hasn't been the same since. It started with that team being the most overhyped championship team in the history of the world. If you win a championship, you're a great team, plain and simple. No arguments from me, but they were talked about like they were the Celtics of the 80s when they only won one championship together. Compare how they're talked about to how the Detroit Pistons from that same time period is talked about. Both won one title in 2 finals appearances. The Pistons actually went to 4 Eastern Conference finals in addition to those finals appearances during their run. The Celtics only had 1 additional Eastern Conference finals appearance. That Celtics team barely escaped their first round series with the Hawks, needing 7 games to beat a team who had won just 37 regular season games and were led by Joe Johnson and Josh Smith. And they needed another 7 games to take down the Cavs, who were led by LeBron and Wally Szczerbiak. A great team, a championship team, but overhyped out the ass to the point we cannot escape players from this team in a way that is detrimental to the game itself. Look at Paul Pierce. Paul was a good player, but outside of Dirk, no player has had their legacy more affected by a single title, and at least Dirk seems cool. Paul took this title and used it to carry himself as though he was an all-time great. This was a guy who pre-title was comparable to Trae Young in terms of what he had accomplished. A couple of playoff runs, including an Eastern Conference Finals appearance early on, but they weren't going to accomplish anything else with him as the guy. Then he gets 2 of the best players in the league at the time in KG and Ray Allen. They win this ring and we're supposed to treat him like he's on Larry Bird's level. And again, he was a very good player. He had some moments, he was clutch, but he wasn't that. He was so obnoxious about it that he actually got us all to agree with Draymond when Paul was dragging the rest of what was left of his career on a farewell tour, and Dre had to remind him that we don't love him like that. He ain't Kobe. Then he parlays this artificially inflated public profile into a job at ESPN, where he spends all his time trying to convince us that he was better than Dwayne Wade and LeBron, instead of providing any actual basketball analysis, which ironically is what Draymond does now to Rudy Gobert. The only good thing he did was get fired for going on IG Live smoking a blunt surrounded by women twerking in bikinis, but now he's popped back up on Undisputed to try and help Skip Bayless hold on to his last shred of relevance. And Paul isn't even the most obnoxious sports media personality unleashed on us from that 08 title team. No, that would be Kendrick Perkins. Kendrick was drafted out of high school in 2003 when that was still a thing. He was a tough kid with a grown man's face and body, but was never able to develop an offensive game. However, he was forced to start with the 08 Celtics because of everything they gave up to get KG and Ray Allen, and he turned into an above average defender. No offense, all defense. Big guys were a thing at the time because of all the dominant big men in the league. To give you an idea of Perk's game, according to Basketball Reference, guys with similar careers to Perk are Scott Pollard, who was actually his teammate on that 08 title team, and Matt Geiger. Fun Matt Geiger fact, he actually had a full head of hair at one point. You needed guys like that, but they weren't particularly memorable guys outside of when you're sitting around naming forgotten athletes. But sometimes those guys have the best insights into the game because they had to think through it more than someone who is naturally gifted, so I had high hopes for Perk the analyst. On top of that, he had a great story. He was raised on a farm in a small Texas town by his grandparents. His mom had been killed when he was young, and his dad was a pro basketball player in New Zealand who never came around. This is a guy who you want to see make it, and he did. But his media career has been thoroughly disappointing. He basically serves as ESPN's vessel for spreading ridiculous NBA thoughts when Stephen A needs a break. He doesn't lean on his playing experience really. He isn't particularly funny or charismatic. He doesn't even seem to genuinely believe the takes he's giving half the time. He's just doing a poor Stephen A impersonation and becoming a caricature of himself. But Doc wasn't done spawning bad sports media personalities. No, he moved on to coach the Los Angeles Clippers, as hilariously depicted by Lawrence Fishburne in the Hulu series Clipped, and has been aiding and abetting hot take artists ever since. Remember Ryan Hollins? He was trying the Perk shtick before Perk, but was even less convincing, so he didn't last long. His thing was hating on Giannis's game. Not Giannis's brother like a proper sports media personality, but Giannis himself. Didn't matter what Giannis did, it wasn't good enough for Ryan, whose career high with the Clippers was 13 points. He got into an argument with Chris Broussard about Giannis, saying, among many things, that Giannis had gotten worse since 2019, and Giannis ball no longer worked for the Bucks. He said this on July 20th, 2021. Later that night, the Bucks won the NBA championship thanks to a 50-point performance by Giannis. Another member of those Clippers teams was Matt Barnes, who is now the co-host of the All the Smoke podcast. Matt has been hell-bent on proving to everyone that he's the toughest man on earth ever since he made the NBA. Sometimes he uses this power for good, like when he tried to beat up Derek Fisher, but mostly he uses it for stuff like trying to fight the high schooler doing play-by-play for one of his kids' basketball games. Isn't it wild how it's often the most disrespectful person you know who's the one ready to crash out at the smallest of perceived slights? But that's Matt. His sports takes are dripping with this too, and would look way worse if his co-host Steven Jackson wasn't even more ridiculous about the whole thing. And the list keeps getting longer. Doc literally and figuratively spawned my next example, Austin Rivers. Austin was the '08 Celtics version of a high school prospect, an undersized two-guard chucker with a nice mixtape, but was way overhyped. He was also on his way out the league, nothing more than trade filler to make contracts match by just his third year in the NBA. He was drafted by the Pelicans, had one of the worst rookie seasons ever, then he was traded to the Celtics, with Doc having moved on to the Clippers by this point, and Boston was about to waive him when guess who came calling? That's right, the Clippers. They put together a 3-team trade of end-of-the-bench players so Austin could play for his dad without the distinction of having been waived. He hung around, thankfully never having to play any truly meaningful minutes because of who his coach was, until he finally broke through enough to secure his only major contract in the league. He then promptly faded back into obscurity before playing himself out of the NBA. Now we get to hear him give hot takes, which means stepping out of his lane to give WNBA hot takes that involve him calling the best player in the league, A'ja Wilson, AJ Wilson. Call me crazy, but if you don't know how to say the best player's name, perhaps more research is needed before you start sharing your so-called expertise. Doc's reverse Midas touch powers didn't stop there. He also has given us someone who was a prominent sports media personality like everyone else I just mentioned, and now another member of Doc's coaching tree, just like Monty Williams, and much to my dismay, JJ Redick. Until very, very recently, JJ was one of the best basketball minds in sports media. Don't believe me? Just ask him. He's quickly entered the Pat McAfee zone for me, which is wild because I do think he's one of the best at interviewing NBA players in the industry. Unfortunately, he branched out from that by repurposing Twitter and Reddit takes as his own anti-hot takes and delivering some of the most uninspiring color commentary in the history of sports. He and Doris Burke had the chemistry of two bitter exes who were set up on a blind date with each other. And what's crazy is we wouldn't have been subjected to JJ's color commentary if the guy before him was still there. Who was that again? Oh yeah, Doc Rivers, who didn't even make it to the All-Star break before Dirty Mac'ing his way into Adrian Griffin's coaching job with the Bucks. And Doc's the only reason we care about JJ in the first place because his career took off under Doc. Before that, JJ was the asshole from Duke who didn't live up to the hype, but Doc figured out how to use him and saved him from being a poor man's Kyle Korver. And now look at what I have to live with. Pulling for a team coached by the world's most condescending man. A man with no coaching experience, assistant or otherwise, to speak of. Just co-host a podcast with LeBron. Is being a podcast host all it takes? Bring back the Low Gators and give me an interview. If you're gonna pick a guy associated with Doc Rivers, I would have much preferred Sam Cassell. He has years of experience as an assistant. He just won a title with the Celtics. Everybody talks highly about him, and he was on those Rocket teams I loved as a kid. The JJ hire could work out, but it won't be on purpose. It's crazy to have someone's first ever non-youth basketball coaching experience be for a team that's supposed to be, heavy quotation marks here, a title contender. Especially when the optics are that you hired him because LeBron co-hosts a podcast with him. How does that play in the locker room? Will players respect him or just look at him as LeBron's puppet? Part of the reason he was so good at interviewing players is he wasn't particularly confrontational, and he always took the player's side in his first take appearances and didn't offer up much in the form of criticism. He's gonna have to do that as a coach. Can he? Based on his known experience, which again is doing what I'm doing right now, the answer is no. We also don't know how he handles the in-game stuff. Is that something you want someone learning on the fly if you're supposed to be a contender? Feels a lot like the Lakers care more about the brand, about keeping LeBron happy than they do about winning. If Jerry West was still alive, he probably would have smashed another MVP trophy when he found out. And the only good thing about him dying is we got to see the video of him dragging JJ's Bob Cousy take one more time. So as you can see, I'm miserable, and whether directly or indirectly, Doc Rivers has caused it all. He's ruining basketball, sports media, and my life, and nobody's doing anything to stop him. He just keeps getting jobs. I don't understand. He's at the center of every terrible event like some sort of evil Forrest Gump. This ends with him somehow becoming president. Anyways, I have to go process the rest of this Lakers news, as well as the inevitability of us drafting Bronny James. This has been another episode of Beyond the Arc with Brandon Silvers. Appreciate you watching, listening, rating, subscribing, reviewing, and sharing. Hope you have a fantastic week, and I will catch you later.